Hello, Clement29 here. Since we're still a few weeks out from the Rush Hour series returning and finishing out its first season, I thought I'd take these next few weeks leading up to that to do some retrospective reviews of the Rush Hour movies. So, without further ado, I thought I'd get into doing a retrospective review of Rush Hour 1. Now, I'll be looking at this from the same criteria that I look at the TV that I would look at an episode of the show with, and also compare and contrast a little bit to things that relate to the show, but between the show and the movie. I'll be doing this for each movie and as I get to them in the next weeks. So of course, this is going to be over Rush Hour 1. Now, first off, I want to talk about the story for this for this movie. It's the story is mainly focused on Lee and the kidnapping of Soo-young, the daughter of the consulate and a student of Lee's. And in a way, sort of like a niece, since he's kind of like an uncle to her. And it shows him his journey coming to America, working with Carter, trying to get her back. Lee is pretty much the main character of this story for the entire time. And it focuses heavily on him. Carter's really here for, comedic relief. I mean, why else did you get Chris Tucker working in the movie? Chris Tucker's hilarious, so of course they'd get him for comic relief. But the stories actually can be pretty dark and serious, and it's actually kind of interesting looking back from the looking back at the movie and just looking at how seriously it took it. All the movies at times take themselves seriously, and if they didn't, they wouldn't be enjoyable. I mean, this isn't Spaceballs. But it is interesting, and it's a nice story. It's very, very, very self-contained, very tight, and the only thing it leaves open is the trip that Lee and Carter take at the end of the movie. In fact, this is one that I think the show actually kind of pulls from the most when it comes to story, and I'm not just talking about them literally copying it for the pilot. This is definitely the one that feels the most related. This is the one that it feels like they took most inspiration from, rather than Rush Hour 2 or 3 when it comes to the style of stories. This one is, in all honesty, the most grounded of all three movies. So, obviously, for a more low budget show, they can't go for the big spectacle of something like Rush Hour 2 or the over the top scenes of Rush Hour 3. But it's still a nice story though, and honestly it still holds up today. You don't really see... usually when movies do comedy, especially action comedy, sometimes they let the plot fall to the wayside. And it looks here like they had plot and comedy were both very much focused on equally. And I like that. I like a good story. Now, looking at the humor of this movie, it's funny going back, realizing how little humor there is. And it's actually really hilarious. There are some absolutely hilarious lines. There are some downright memorable lines, especially the, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?" I mean, everyone quotes that. Or, you have and you have lines like, "It's G14 classified." And then you have the scene where Lee is teaching Carter how to flip the gun around on someone. You have lighthearted moments and funny moments, but they're more sprinkled throughout a fairly serious movie. And it's actually kind of funny, because we all laugh at the moments, and I realized that they weren't overplaying the comedy. And it's funny, because I hadn't thought about that until I went back and rewatched it to do this video. They never try to shove humor in your face. They don't say, "Okay, here's a scene. We need to make this funny." They have scenes play out and then jokes would happen. And a lot of the humor does come from basically just Carter being Carter and him interacting with everyone else who's taking themselves seriously, and he's the only person not taking things completely seriously. And he's played by Chris Tucker. And Chris Tucker plus anything is going to equal wacky hijinks. But, you know, and I do think it's funny is that they focused on the comedy, but they didn't overdo it. They're like, they had their jokes and they put them in the movie, and they obviously didn't say, no, we need to overdo this, or we need to throw some jokes in. I'm sure some of the jokes were, I'm sure there were some ad-libbed jokes, but, especially, you know, dealing, you know, Chris Tucker, I mean, all those kinds of actors are always gonna throw something in. But it is nice that they didn't try to force comedy into the movie, and what do we have? A very beloved movie that is still quoted like almost 20 years later. Like, that's impressive. The action in this movie it's actually not as big as the latter two movies, but, you know, you still got your good Jackie Chan fight scenes. Just something that the movie... Oh, forgot to talk about comedy in the show. Yeah, the show actually plays a little more humorous, especially, you know, depending on the episode. Some episodes are being a little more humorous than others. But on top of having, you know, you have Carter in the show being, you know, Carter, and you have Lee being dry, like that, delivering that sarcasm all the time. And then you have Gerald, who basically is the major comic relief in the show, and he's where a lot of the humor comes from. And I've said how much, you know, he's hilarious. So it is funny that, you know, it actually doesn't play it up as much as like Rush Hour 3 does, but it doesn't do it as little as Rush Hour 1. They definitely add a little more comedy. They definitely balance it more than this one, because in the movie it's very much, you know, your action drama with some comedy. This one is the show is very much action comedy. And I do appreciate that approach as well, because it's still not overdoing it, and it's not trying to, you know, constantly shove jokes in your face, but it does take the comedy and it does, you know, work as a comedy, and I like that as well, especially since the story doesn't suffer as a result. Well, most times. I know, it's the action, and one of the things, getting back to the action, one of the things that the show misses is that, you know, some of the fight scenes are done, you know, they don't have slow motion in the movies, but, you know, just Jackie Chan just has this style to him. And it's so hard. It's almost impossible to just replicate that. You can't just copy that. And again, but I did notice in this movie that the action scenes aren't as crazy as Jackie Chan fight scenes tend to be. I mean, if you look at a movie like, you know, Shanghai Nights, you know, or Rush Hour 2 or 3. Rush Hour 2, I remember specifically. I have to rewatch. It's been a while since I've actually sat down and watched the entirety of Rush Hour 3. But, you know, Jackie Chan has done some bigger stunts than that one. But, you know, he still has those, like, the really quirky. I remember specifically one where he's getting away from Carter, and he's hopping on cars, and he like jumps into this RV. He climbs down through the opening on top, and he goes in there and he hops in a cab. You know, it's just these little quirky things that it's fun to watch. You know, it's fun to watch, and you know, a lot of these are shot in you know, one continuous shot, and it's not like a bunch of jump cuts. You know, that's a problem a lot of times people have with, you know, action scenes. And the show does dip into this sometimes. When it comes to doing action, it does a lot of cuts and suffers from the slow motion. And occasionally the show does hit, and I've mentioned this before, the show does hit, you know, those moments that feel Jackie Chan-esque, when they use Lee to the extent that you really should, just with a little too much slow motion. But yeah, the show actually does use a little more action. I mean, I guess, you know, per episode then, yeah, it really depends on the episode, but it does use a lot more action than the movie does, because, you know, the movie deals a lot of, you know, character development, and given that it only has like an hour, a little over an hour and a half, it doesn't have a whole season to deal with that. So we get a lot more action per episode. If you talk about the actors and the characters, Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker are iconic in this movie. They really work well with each other, and you can just tell, how well they play off of each other. Playing Lee and Carter, it's, and it's something that's hard to, it's one of those things, you can't replicate that kind of chemistry. Excuse me. Because, when two actors click, they click. And you can't get two other actors playing those roles and make them click in the exact same way. Maybe, there are moments like that in the show where they do have those moments, and I pointed that out. It's just, they're just, those moments are few and far between when it comes to being just like the movies. Rush Hour 1 is actually the one movie that has, did anyone return for Rush Hour 2? You got the Consulate and Soo-young in Rush Hour 3, but I don't think, actually now that I think about it, I don't think Rush Hour 1 had any characters that came back. The FBI guys, that one woman, the short hair, the bomb expert lady, she doesn't come back. Hell, honestly, I don't think we actually even see the precinct that he works at, the LAPD, in any of the other movies. Yeah, because even in Rush Hour 3, they pretty much you see him doing street traffic, and then they go to France. But yeah, I was going to think about the actors, but I guess they didn't do much with that. This is actually where they pull a lot of the cast from, and what would basically become the supporting characters for the Rush Hour show. The captain is played by a woman instead of a man in the show, and it's not like he had much of a character anyway. He was just one of those, I really can't stand Carter, and I'm going to get him out of the way by making him work with the FBI. Dee Dee is actually, I think she's very heavily based off of, check that, the bomb disposal lady, but they really reworked the character. Like, she's entirely different. And better. Like, I like it. I like the development Dee Dee's gotten, even if it's only a little bit. Dee Dee is like my favorite side character in the entire show. And then you have the douchey guy with the mustache. I think he's actually closer to the FBI, to that one FBI guy, the one who's like, G14 classified. That's good. I think he's the mustache guy is supposed to be like him, because he's definitely the designated jerk. Even if he does, even if, like, especially in episode 5, he wasn't just, the jerk. He was actually involved with what was going on. But yeah, this is where they really pull the cast from. And it's funny, like, a lot of these actors do a good job at it. And it's kind of funny that none of them ended up coming back. I mean, granted, I'm glad they didn't force any cameos in later movies. Like, hey, you remember this person from the first movie? Because, a lot of times movie series will do that just to be like, hey, nostalgia. So I'm glad that the movies didn't do that, but it's kind of funny. Now that I think about it, most of them never even came back. It is interesting, though, that, seeing the show take these characters and actually expand on this a little bit, since, like I said before, they have to sustain a show, so they need more characters. So they have the three main side characters, and, the Captain, Dee Dee, and Mustache Guy. I can't remember most of their names. But, yeah, it's interesting with that. I mean, the movie definitely handled the characters in a much more grounded way. They can't get into like a bunch of super details with it, but I mean, it's funny trying to compare this because, things are naturally going to be different in a show compared to a movie. And, with the movie, you get, like, Carter's backstory mainly involves his father, specifically to be relevant to parallel Lee's relationship with his father. And both of those backstories are changed in the TV show with, well, naturally, of course, since Lee has a sister that doesn't exist in the show, or that doesn't exist in the movie. Excuse me. And, you talk about them being orphaned, and then Carter growing up in this sort of like being raised by this older lady who adopted him. So, it is interesting to see these different approaches. One serves the movie, one serves the TV show. A movie has to be pretty brief. With only an hour and a half, you have to carefully pick what you're doing. Because you can't have a bunch of character development, a character backstory just taking up the show. So that's why, when we see stuff in the show, we get some of that in an episode, and we'll get a little bit later, and a little bit more some there. But with a movie, you can't do that. That's why it's a simple story involving, talking about his dad, and how his dad died, compared to how Lee's dad died. So, looking at this as a whole, at least from the 8 episodes we've seen of the show compared to the first movie, this is definitely where the show takes most of its inspiration from. It's definitely the similar style, but of course more for a general police show, but with Rush Hour stylings. The show does take a little bit more comedy to it, and I actually like this as a different thing. And I will say, if you're adapting a movie, especially a beloved movie like Rush Hour, into a show, you're definitely going to have to change stuff simply for the format. And I said this before, and it's one of the criticisms I had for the pilot, since it just tried to cram the entire first movie into one episode, and it just didn't work. Especially since they barely changed anything, except to accommodate the general changes. But, it is nice to see after that they did make changes that ended up serving the show in the long run and give it a better structure. The movie still, I think, is better, simply because, it's a Jackie Chan movie. It's a classic. It's I think, a 1998 movie. So, it's got, bigger production values, and it's much better put together. It's much more tightly made than the show. Though the show needs to be a little more open-ended, like I said, considering the format. If you had to ask me which one I enjoy more, just out of sheer nostalgia, I would have to say the first movie. The show does stuff that I like, but, the movie is still enjoyable, and honestly, I think I'm going to rewatch it again. After I do, probably tomorrow. Because, man, it's just a classic. Once the show is done, and if it's going to end up being completely canceled with no chance of ever coming back, and I'll look back after we watch the whole season, and I can probably make a judgment after that. But eventually I'll be doing a whole retrospective on the show, at the very least the first season. Which, sadly, as much as I would love for the show to come back, it's probably not going to get that second season. But we can look back and say that at least I liked what the show was then. But yes, this is my retrospective review of Rush Hour 1, and I will be posting the retrospective review in comparison to the show for Rush Hour 2 next week. Thank you for watching.